This is the Bible Book Club. I'm Heather.
And I'm Susan.
And we're in the book of 1 Kings. Welcome to the club. Last episode, in chapters 8 through 10, the nation of Israel celebrated the dedication of the temple and the Feast of the Tabernacles with 14 days of roasted sacrifices. Those Israelites knew how to throw a party. The Lord appeared to Solomon and promised him that if he was faithful, he would establish his throne forever. The author then summarized the works of Solomon, the debt he acquired, the labor he forced, the religious obligations he fulfilled, and his shipping expansion. Lastly, there was the intriguing visit from the Queen of Sheba.
So in the last episode, the word got out about the king and his relationship with the Lord. And the news of his wealth brought this influential queen to his door, the Queen of Sheba. And she saw the hand of the Lord in Solomon's fame, and she actually praised God for it. Perhaps she may have even taken that good news of the Lord home with her and used it to influence her community. In this case, Solomon's influence was used for good. It glorified God. Now, in this episode, Solomon will solidify his influencer status. It's going to grow, but he will stray, no longer using his influence for good. It seems to be a particular pitfall or temptation of influencers to use their influence for bad. Too much fame and fortune lead to self-gratification, and too much of self leaves very little room for the Lord. And when Solomon fails to value the Lord, he's going to break the covenant. Scene 1, Solomon's wealth.
Chapter 10, continued in verse 14. The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents, not including the revenues from merchants and traders and from all the Arabian kings and the governors of the territories.
So Solomon is up to about 25 tons of gold annually, plus revenue from trade, taxes, and tolls. Solomon probably ran out of space to store his gold, and it was just so lovely to look at. So he probably thought, why hide it? Instead, he decorated the palace with the gold.
Verse 16, King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each shield. He also made 300 small shields of hammered gold, with 3 minas of gold in each shield. The king put them in the palace of the forest of Lebanon.
The 200 large shields are called targets, and they were like body length. So think of this oblong shield covered in gold. And the 300 small shields were round and smaller, and these shields, none of them, were for war. They were decorative. They hung in the palace and probably were worn by the soldiers when the king processed in public or for like grand marches and ceremonies. The bottom line is he's decorating with gold.
Do we still know where any of these are?
No, because remember
artifacts.
when they're taken captive, everything is stripped.
They carried them away.
Yeah.
Darn. Verse 18, then the king made a great throne covered with ivory and overlaid with fine gold. The throne had 6 steps, and its back had a rounded top. On both sides of the seat were armrests with a lion standing beside each of them. 12 lions stood on 6 steps, one at either end of each step. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom. All King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. The king had a fleet of trading ships at sea, along with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years, it returned, carrying gold, silver, and ivory, and apes and baboons.
The throne was like no other before it in any other kingdom. It was gold, all gold. It was 6 steps up, which meant even if the king were sitting, he would be above anyone standing before him. Add to that the picture of a pack of lions lining the steps. The king sat on gold, he drank out of gold, and he only used gold for everything else in his house because it says silver just wasn't good enough. So what is really going on with all the gold? What is the author trying to tell us? Certainly, This is a clue, a message, because our author is blatantly focused on ensuring we have a golden picture of Solomon. Gold is mentioned 13 times in this one chapter alone. Now, the way our author has written the last 2 chapters, there is a stark turn in Solomon's fortune. Solomon had to borrow gold from Hiram, the king of Tyre, to cover the temple in gold. However, since that initial loan, the flow of unencumbered gold has steadily grown, and the use of this stream of gold has been carefully itemized for us. Solomon had initially used all the gold for the temple, good cause, but the temple was complete and completely covered in gold. So was it wrong to use the gold for everything else? What picture did this present to the public? Did the golden splendor of all that was Solomon's become so bright that it eclipsed the temple? Who was looking more golden? Did the gold point to Solomon or to God? Our influencer, Solomon, is beginning to turn inward. The desires of his heart have turned to gold and have outweighed his desire for God. What a lesson for us, a generation that basks in the afterglow of influencers. What are we being influenced for? Our personal gain or theirs or God's? If an influencer is not focused outward on the good of others, then their sole purpose for their influence is on personal gold. In our last episode, Solomon used his gold to influence the Queen of Sheba for God's glory. In this episode, we read of his turning away from God. Solomon is using his gold to glorify himself.
Well, that's convicting if I've ever heard of something convicting. Continuing in verse 23, King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought a gift, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons, spices, and horses and mules. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Q. The royal merchants purchased them from Q at the current price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and of the Arameans.
So Solomon is now loaded. He's loaded with treasure and he's loaded with followers. He was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings, and the whole world sought an audience with him. The whole world. Could it be that Solomon was the greatest influencer that ever lived? But what happens when an influencer loses their way? Solomon wanted to influence others about God originally, but the temporary glitter of gold has blinded him to the light of the Lord. His own desires have grown and his desire for God has diminished. Solomon has turned. He is breaking God's commands. He has accumulated chariots and horses, which he knows he shouldn't do because Deuteronomy 17 is very clear about that. Heather's going to read it. But the reason we know Solomon knew about this is every king had to make a copy of the law, handwritten, so that he would know every word.
Deuteronomy 17, verse 16. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again, neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself.
Solomon has 12,000 horses, which he should not have. Neither should he be multiplying wives for himself, lest they turn his heart from God. But it's too late. Solomon has left his first love and continues breaking commands by loving too many women. Scene 2, Solomon's wives.
Chapter 11. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from the nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nonetheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray.
Our author is really building a case against Solomon with the gold, the horses, and now the women. He begins chapter 11 with King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women. Compare that to the beginning of Solomon's reign in chapter 3, verse 3, where it says, "And Solomon loved the Lord." And now he loves women. The use of however in this chapter tells us that there has been a shift in Solomon's heart and a clue as to where his heart defected. Solomon's heart has shifted from loving God to loving women. In fact, Solomon doesn't just love women, he's obsessed with them. Anyone with over 1,000 women is clearly fixated. And I have questions as to how this worked for him. I would like to know if the wives had to wear name tags, because can you imagine the awkwardness of meeting a spouse in the hall and not remembering her name? Where did they all sleep? A compound of 1,000 women is a lot. When did they sleep with him? Was there a rotation, a calendar, a master planner, a hierarchy of favorites? Was there like tryouts or training, a farm league, a major league? How did one get promoted?
Was there a lot of drama?
I guess so. And what about children? This is interesting. Only just three children are named in the Bible. But really, there had to be more. Or wasn't there? There are several theories on the lack of children mentioned in the Bible. Some say that they just weren't recorded. However, the cultural norm was focused on sons. And as David's line was so important to the future of Israel, it's really likely that if Solomon had any more sons, they would have been recorded, which leads some to believe that Solomon had a fertility problem. Others suggest that he did not really sleep with most of these women. They were merely political alliances. I don't care. He had to at least have more children, unless there was a problem. Struggling with temptation of women is not new. Samson and David both struggled with women, but neither had the time or money to support this kind of harem. Solomon had the time and the money, and he got carried away, far away from the God he originally loved. The God that gave him the wisdom to prosper so greatly. The God that gave him the favor to prosper so greatly. Scene 3, Solomon's fall.
1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites.
So Solomon loved a diversity of women. They included Pharaoh's daughter, an Egyptian, in addition to Moabite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women. There were probably many other nations in that 1,000. But the author has a point about these nations. First, it is thought Solomon entered into these relationships as a mean of creating a treaty of peace with enemy nations, which meant he was relying more on man and his own treaties than God for the protection of Israel. Second, the author wants us to know that Solomon knew better. Deuteronomy 7 states very clearly that marrying Hittites would result in idolatry. Foreign women were a potential source of trouble because they brought their native gods with them, which often influenced their husband and children away from the one true God of Israel. Of course, this wasn't always the case in the Bible. Tamar in Genesis 38, Ruth in the book of Ruth, Rahab in Joshua 2, and Jael in Judges 4 were all foreign women who adopted the one true God and left idolatry. But the reality is, with so many wives, 1,000, there would be many who would not make the choice to follow God. And there are many examples of that too in the Bible and other places. Samson's wife in Judges 14, Ahab's wife Jezebel in 1 Kings 16. Nehemiah, many years later, is not going to let anyone forget Solomon's mistake. Listen to what he says to the men about Solomon specifically, who married pagan women in Nehemiah 13.
Nehemiah 13, starting in verse 23. In those days, I also saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod and could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke according to the language of one of the other people. So I contended with them and cursed them, struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, saying, "You shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin. Should we then hear of your doing all this great evil, transgressing against our God by marrying pagan women?"
Nehemiah was so mad he pulled out their hair. Now, his point is this, that if Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived and loved the Lord, could be distracted by pagan women, so could they.
Now back to our story in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 6. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molecheth, detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods.
Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This is not the first time we have heard the phrase, did evil in the eyes of the Lord. In season 7 of Judges, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Often, it said. In season 9 of 1 Samuel, Saul did evil in the eyes of the Lord. In season 10 of 2 Samuel, David did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And here we are in season 11, and Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This pattern will continue. There will be many more kings that did evil in the eyes of the Lord, because all of these kings were born with sin. The case for a savior from sin is building.
And in fact, we have a chart that we will put in the show notes that kind of details out all of the kings of Israel. And what's really fascinating in here is the great majority of them did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Solomon did some good, but also a lot of evil in the eyes of the Lord. You can go look at that in the show notes.
The result of Solomon's foreign loves was devastating for the nation of Israel. Solomon, the great influencer of all Israel and the world, began to follow Ashtoreth, a Canaanite god of war and sexuality, Molech, an Ammonite god associated with child sacrifices, and Chemosh, a Moabite god known for war and also child sacrifices. Scene 3, Solomon's consequence.
Verse 9, the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David, your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but I will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen."
Because Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord lets him know that he has broken the covenant. Solomon, the great king who built the temple of God, who prayed with such passion, followed the influence of his wives and their gods, and he worshiped them. Solomon, the great influencer, caved to the influence of others. Solomon gained many loves, but lost his first love, the Lord. It was a failing of the heart. In fact, the word heart is mentioned 5 times in these first 13 verses of chapter 11. The heart is what God has always wanted from us. It is clear in the Old Testament and the New. Listen to Deuteronomy 6:5 from the Old Testament.
You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength.
And Matthew 22:37 from the New Testament.
Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind.
God desires us to have a heart for the Lord, like David did. Solomon failed to love the Lord, and the Lord was angry. Why? Because he had turned from God, whom he knew personally, to a bunch of false gods that Solomon had never even seen or heard. And the author lets us know that God had appeared to him twice. How can you not believe a God who appears to you? That's really bad. The consequence, like I said, was devastating for Israel. In the next generation, the nation will be divided. It says that God will tear the kingdom away from Solomon, which may sound familiar if you were with us in season 9, episode 8, because Samuel said the same thing.
1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 28. Samuel said to King Saul, The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors.
The same song, but a different tune. The kingdom was torn from Saul and now Solomon. Saul lost the whole kingdom. Solomon's son will lose 10 tribes. This, though, was Solomon's fault. How can one so wise make such bad choices? Saul, the first king, fell because of pride and idolatry. Now Solomon, the third king, despite being the wisest man ever, has fallen because of indulgence and idolatry. And again, God has set the stage for proof of humanity's need for a divine savior. No human king could save Israel. Only the King of Kings, the Son of God. And we'll get to him in our story eventually. Unfortunately, we're going to have to go through a lot of other kings first. Scene 4. Solomon's peace perishes. Solomon has committed evil, and the peace that he enjoyed, the peace that his father David fought his whole life for, will come to an end. God is going to raise up 3 adversaries against Solomon: Hadad, Rezon, and Jeroboam. This should come as no surprise because God is simply doing what he told David he would do in 2 Samuel 7:12.
When your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever.
So the consequence is not going to be as bad as Saul's. The whole kingdom is not going to be torn away. But Solomon's about to be chastened with the rod and blows of men. The first adversary to rise up against Solomon is Hadad from Edom.
Back to our story in 1 Kings chapter 11, continuing in verse 14. Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom. Earlier, when David was fighting with Edom, Joab, the commander of the army, who had gone up to bury the dead, had struck down all the men in Edom. Joab and all the Israelites stayed there for 6 months until they had destroyed all the men in Edom. But Hadad, still only a boy, fled to Egypt with some Edomite officials who had served his father. They set out from Midian and went to Paran. Then, taking people from Paran with them, they went to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave Hadad a house and land and provided him with food. Pharaoh was so pleased with Hadad that he gave him a sister of his own wife, Queen Tahpenes, in marriage. The sister of Tahpenes bore him a son named Genubath, whom Tahpenes brought up in the royal palace. There, Genubath lived with Pharaoh's own children. While he was in Egypt, Hadad heard that David rested with his ancestors and that Joab, the commander of the army, was also dead. Then Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me go that I may return to my own country." "What if you lacked here that you want to go back to your own country?" Pharaoh asked. Nothing, Hadad replied, but do let me go.
So the Edomites descended from Esau, who was Jacob's twin brother. They were descendants of Abraham. Actually, Abraham was their grandfather, but they weren't always friends. Their land bordered Judah to the southeast. Now, David had reduced them in battle, the Edomites, but Hadad survived and rose to influence by marrying a relation of Pharaoh's queen. Hadad makes Solomon his enemy and becomes connected with Solomon's second adversary, Rezon from Zobah.
Verse 23, and God raised up against Solomon another adversary, Rezon, son of Eliada, who had fled from his master Hadadezer, king of Zabath. When David destroyed Zabath's army, Rezon gathered a band of men around him and became their leader. They went to Damascus, where they settled and took control. Rezon was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. So Rezon ruled in Aram and was hostile toward Israel.
So these guys remind me of they're just like a thorn in the flesh. They just keep bothering Solomon. Now, Rezon is another refugee from David's defeats. He took control of Damascus, which was south of Hebron, and set up a garrison there. Rezon had a significant holding in Israel and formed a dynasty there, resisting Solomon for the remaining years of his rule. And now we get to the third adversary, Jeroboam the Israelite. This is the consequence that hurts. This is where the seed is planted to divide God's people. Jeroboam was an Israelite from the tribe of Ephraim. He was a descendant of Joseph's. Now recall that Joseph, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, received a double portion of the promised land because of how he saved them in Egypt against Pharaoh. So Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, became 2 of the 12 tribes. Next to Judah, the tribe of Ephraim is the second most powerful. So this is a big tribe, and Jeroboam is from that tribe. So he's got a lot of people. In the beginning of our story, Jeroboam is a servant working for Solomon.
Verse 26. Also, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zeradah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. Here is the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall of the city of David his father. Now, Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the tribes of Joseph. About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah the prophet of Shiloh met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David, Solomon's father, did. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David, my servant, whom I chose, and who obeyed my commands and decrees. I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes. I will give 1 tribe to his son so that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel, if you do whatever I command you and walk in obedience to me and do what is right in my eyes by obeying my decrees and commands, as David my servant did. I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shushank, the king, and stayed there until Solomon's death.
So prophets are often very dramatic characters, and Ahijah appears to Jeroboam out of nowhere, and we know nothing about him. He tears up his new coat, symbolically giving Jeroboam 10 pieces representing the 10 tribes he would rule over. The imagery of the beautiful new coat torn to pieces fits because in verse 11, God had said he would tear the kingdom, Solomon's beautiful new kingdom, from him, just as the prophet tore his beautiful new coat. For Jeroboam, the 10 pieces of coat proved he wasn't dreaming, because as a servant of the wisest, richest king on earth, the minute he was alone, he probably started second guessing that he'd been told he would defeat King Solomon. Jeroboam will rule over 10 tribes of Israel, is what the prophet said. David's grandson will get just one tribe, the tribe of Judah. Well, 10 plus 1 does not equal 12 tribes, so where's the other tribe? It is assumed that the tribe of Benjamin has been absorbed into Judah. Scene 5, Solomon's death.
Verse 41, As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the Annals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son succeeded him as king.
This is the first time our author has used this closing king formula. From here on out, every time a king dies, we will get a summary of the place of reign. For Solomon, it was Jerusalem. The length of his reign, Solomon's was 40 years. An appraisal of his reign as good or evil, and the successor, which in this case is going to be Rehoboam. With the death of David and Solomon, the two greatest kings in Israel's history, we enter a period of political instability and religious turmoil. Does this sound familiar? We're right back where we started. Stay tuned for the second part of the book of 1 Kings and the beginning of the divided kingdom.
What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, Welcome to the club. New episodes drop every Monday, and get all episodes now on Amazon Music. As always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Haley Mawat.